Welcome, everybody. This is the first episode of my new podcast, The Psychosocial. It's all about inspiring conversations with leading figures in the field of trauma, adversity, and resilience-informed practice. And my name is Warren Larkin. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and managing director at Warren Larkin Associates. And I run a consultancy that helps systems and organizations effectively meet needs of service users and staff by applying the science of trauma and resilience. And I spent 30 years working with people affected by trauma. I'm really delighted that my first guest on this new venture is Ben Perks, who you'll see here. Ben has had an amazing career. He's currently head of campaigns and advocacy in the Division of Global Communications and Advocacy at the United Nations Children's Fund in New York. Ben's in New York. It's very hot and humid today, I believe.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, and we're having an unusually hot day here in Lancashire as well. And what else do I need to say? You're leading on public and policy advocacy on the development and protection of children. And it's kind of amazing, really, because your childhood was less than perfect in many ways, with growing up in care, living in children's home in Birmingham. Very much, the start of your book outlines your experiences when you in your early life. So it's kind of amazing that you're now working on this. Well, it's not amazing. It's kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that you're working on this agenda now. It makes complete sense. But in terms of your book, Trauma Proof, which we can see here, and over there behind Ben, it got some amazing reviews. In fact, pages and pages of reviews on the cover of the book. And I particularly like the fact that Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote one of the most famous books on trauma, The Body Keeps the Score, called it lucid, clear, and visionary. So it doesn't get much better than that. So thank you, Ben, for being my first guest. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Warren. I'm really excited to be on your first, I believe your first podcast in the series. Yeah, just really happy, and thank you for taking the time for the conversation today.
It's a pleasure. And I have to say that your book, I've been listening to it in the car when I'm driving around, and I've also been reading it as well, because, I can do both. Not at the same time, obviously. That would be reckless.
I hope not.
No, but yeah, I think it's been one of those things that I didn't know what to expect, because I know you a little bit and I know of your work. So I was kind of trying to guess what it would be, how it would be presented before I got it. And I have to say that I was kind of really impressed. And I think it takes a lot to impress me at this point, because I've read a lot on this subject. So I'm quite critical. Which is easy for me to say because I've not finished my book on this subject, which is like 5 years late. So it's easy for me to talk, but you've actually finished it. And I think it is a unique contribution because you have very much a personal and professional perspective, but it weaves together that kind of very human element, but also with a very learned and educational and kind of big picture perspective on what needs to change. So I think it's kind of unique in that sense. You normally get one or the other, but you've managed somehow to bring both to the table. So yeah, I think it deserves to be a bestseller.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it will be a bestseller. That's very difficult to achieve bestseller status with a first book on such a difficult subject. It tries to approach a really complex and difficult to talk about subject with a real sense of optimism. And I think that when I first came up with the idea of writing the book, also 4 years ago now when I started working on it, so 5 years is not too bad to be still doing your book. I had this idea that I wanted to write a book that would argue that child trauma or maltreatment and abuse, neglect, lack of nurturing care is the biggest and most costly but least discussed social and public health problem that we have, but that we're the first generation in history that have the knowledge, the reach, the systems, and the capability to end it or dramatically reduce it, as we have done with other public health challenges in the past. But of course, when I took the idea to the agent and eventually the publisher, they loved that and they thought that was great, but they thought it wasn't enough. They wanted me also to talk a lot about healing, about how people can heal at any age. What does that mean? And also a little bit about my own story, but also the stories of lots of other people who are featured in the book from all over the world. So yeah, that's it's been a journey, but I'm glad it's on shelves now, and I'm glad it's particularly on your shelf while we're having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That was going to be my first question about why you wrote the book, but you've kind of explained that. And when you were talking then about this is a difficult subject, and it's really interesting to me that when Felitti and Ander published their original adverse child experiences study in 1998, nobody wanted to know. It was very much, they found it incredibly difficult to get on the stage at conferences. They found it very difficult to get any kind of press attention. It was almost like it wasn't acceptable. It wasn't the kind of subject we should be talking about. So that study didn't really make a massive impact. You would think it would be like up for a Nobel Prize or something, but
Yeah.
it was kind of buried. It was ignored, and it was unpalatable, I think. Have you got a sense of, have you got any thoughts on why that's changed? Maybe.
I don't think it's changed enough.
Okay.
I think the first thing is that when we look at any global public health issue or even changes in industry or the emergence of tech, you always have these early innovators and then you have a lot of resistance and it's hard to get it any new idea mainstreamed into public consciousness and the policy environment. So part of it would be just that. But I also think, child neglect, abuse, trauma, adverse child experiences are hidden in plain sight for mainly three reasons. There are lots of reasons, but three really important reasons. The first one is people's internal sense of chronic shame. People that have been affected by child trauma don't want to talk about it because of the way it makes them feel about themselves, perhaps, but also the way it makes them feel about their family and this conflicting feelings of love, of loving your family, but also being a victim or sometimes of unconscious or conscious abuse and neglect. The second one is social stigma. And in the book, I talk a lot about how the way new research is showing that indeed it is true that stigma is something that society has towards people affected by child trauma. And if you grew up in care, you know that very well because you're at the tip of this iceberg where it's very visible that you're coming from a background of abuse and neglect or abandonment. But the vast majority of people affected by adversity are, it's invisible and hidden.
Yeah.
And so that stigma, it becoming unhidden, gives people a great fear of the stigma in society. And I think the third thing is really about traumatic memory, narrative and memory that Toni Morrison, I believe, called it the pitch battle between remembering and forgetting. Like people as a survival thing tend to try to forget trauma and or not give it a language. And so I think for all of those reasons, it is much more difficult to talk about child trauma than is other public health issues like nutrition or
Yeah.
vaccines or water supply. Those things are much easier to talk about.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant answer. I think we are definitely becoming a bit more open about this. And I think the fact that there are so many books on this subject now and, so many, if you Google trauma informed practice or, adverse
Yeah.
child experiences, you literally get thousands of references. So it is changing, I think. But I just want to start at the beginning. So in terms of your book, you very generously share quite a lot about your own personal experience of growing up and your experience of care, navigating that system in Birmingham. And I guess that, it's clear that that influenced your career choices and your personal healing journey. But I think the thing that interests me is what I'm curious about is what enabled you to survive your childhood and to end up on this really successful trajectory where you're advocating globally for children's rights and children's welfare. Because the odds were really stacked against you, So what do you think enabled you to get to this point?
That's a great question. And I don't think that anybody can ever really know the answer of what helps them in their formative years to become what they are. I think that there's some clues. I talk a lot in the book about the role of my teacher in particular, who I had when I was 15, and a lot of risk and violence and distraction going on around my life. I've been kicked out of a couple of schools. Kids in care were the kind of kids that gangs tried to recruit, and I had all of that stuff going on around the children's home. But I had this teacher that really stepped into my life, and I think she just like made me realize that a lot of the stuff that comes into your head when you live with abandonment, violence, neglect, and abuse is, doesn't completely define you. She made me realize that maybe that I do matter a bit as an individual, and that I can do some stuff with my life, and I've got something to offer to the world. And that was amazing. And I think that's one of the things I argue for very much in the book is, and we'll come to that later on probably, is the role of teachers. I think secondly that I was really optimistic. Like I knew my life was really bad. I knew that I was in a really bad situation, but I always thought it would get better. And I tell this story in the book about every day in the children's home. I would go to the letterbox. I don't know if you remember this from the book. I go to the letterbox, and I kind of expect a letter to come from somebody, like maybe my parents or a family member or like a Miss Havisham style benefactor or someone like that who would say, "This has all been a terrible mistake. We're coming to get you. It'll all be okay." And it didn't matter if I took like a massive beating in the home, or if there was the worst possible thing happened the day before. The next day I would just go and check the letterbox, and of course nothing ever came. But I still went every day, and I told my wife, a few years ago about this before I put it in the book, and she thought it was like really sad, and I thought it wasn't sad. It was a sign of the optimism and the human spirit that even when the odds are stacked against you, you can somehow see a way through. So I was lucky to have that. Maybe that was in my neurobiology, that optimism. I don't know where it comes from, but that was really important. So teacher, optimism, I think those are the things that really helped me to get away from a direct trajectory of maybe gangs or crime or all of that into eventually university, and then other people and the ability to form relationships and so on to some extent helped me also to finally, have a slightly bigger community around me that helped me to go to university and build a job in the UN.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what you say makes so much sense, doesn't it, in terms of the role of safe, trusted adults in young people's lives as a source of resilience. Attachment, ultimately attachment being required
Yeah.
through adolescence, which is technically up to the age of like 25, 26 when your brain stops developing. And also I'm interested in the fact that your survival, if we want to call it that, because on a kind of neurobiological level, you were in survival mode a lot of the time. When you look at stories of people who survived disasters and difficult situations, the thing that separates them from people who don't survive is hope and optimism.
Yeah.
So this idea, they never give up. They always expect it to work out. They always expect some turn of events that's going to be positive in their favor at some point. So it's really interesting that you held on to that hope and optimism, and at the same time had safe attachments, those relationships that kept you going and let you believe in yourself, I guess. So yeah, that was fantastic. It really comes out in the book that those things are fundamental.
Yeah.
I also resonated with, you talked about having imposter syndrome in the book, and you were talking about, despite excelling in your career and being appointed to the UN as agency representative for Montenegro, which is a very, high level prestigious post, you were still struggling with imposter syndrome. So I'm curious about how if did you overcome that? Have you overcome it, or are you still wrestling with it like most of us?
Well, I think there's two sides to it actually, because this week here in New York it was International Day of Play, and one of my jobs is organizing that and leading on that in the UN and globally, and it's a huge event, a UN headquarters, and we have all the ambassadors and world thought leaders on child development in the room, and we have a huge number of kids playing on the lawn at the UN at the backdrop of the iconic UN building, and it's a wonderful day, but I was standing there this year thinking, I can't quite believe I'm doing this. And that's the kid from a children's home in Birmingham,
Yeah.
right? I can't quite believe that this is that I am doing this. I pinch myself, and I think that's a blessing because I think a lot of people show up for work and they take it for granted. And I so the flip side of that is that there are times when can't believe I'm doing it in a negative way. And when I got appointed to be a UN representative, it was that's an ambassadorial rank post in a country, and you have access to prime ministers and ministers, and you have to go to, you know, ambassadorial receptions and all this kind of stuff. And I felt like a fish out of water. And I kept having this sense that somebody would come and tap me on the shoulder and say, "Come on, Pax, we know you don't belong here." And I was always worried that I'd like spill my like a vol au vent down my tie or some like mishap, and everybody would find it gross. But actually, what I realized with time is that most of this is a game in my head, and it's in normal. It's normal. If you grow up in poverty, especially like British people growing up in poverty, class system, or people from children's homes, or people that didn't feel loved or safe with their parents, it's completely normal that they feel intimidated by these kind of environments. And I didn't really realize how common it was until I went through a healing process and understood that so many people are living with different things that make them feel like they're not good enough. Viola Davis said, you know, when you live with abuse and neglect, you end up not just thinking that you did something wrong, but that you are wrong. And so I had that still inside of me when I was going to these receptions. And then one day, an ambassador from a very well-regarded ambassador came up and had a conversation with me, and he had Volavant down his tie, and he didn't care, and nobody cared, and it doesn't matter. And in the end, I realized that this was more about chronic shame rather than social stigma. It was an internal thing. And then I kind of like came out of the closet from being a care background. I wrote in 2019, I wrote a blog called because I grew up in an orphanage, and all the ambassadors and diplomatic corps read it, and they all gave me such feedback and love about the piece, and it didn't make them think any less of me for sure.
Yeah.
So I think I began to understand that that it was game in my head. It was chronic shame and not other people's prejudice. And then now it does come back, but I remind myself that it's a game in my head, and then I feel okay.
Yeah, I think it was really great reading about that actually, because I think so many people, especially if you've come from humble beginnings, or you find yourself in influential positions or high status roles or whatever, leadership roles, it's a battle every day. It's a battle trying to validate yourself and accept that you deserve to be there. You know, you're there because you're good at what you do, or people value your opinion or whatever it is. But I think it's such a common thing. You know, whenever I speak about it at conferences and stuff, there's always a bunch of people come up to me afterwards and go, yeah, I've got that as well. So I think, and when I remember Professor Beck, who invented cognitive therapy, saying that the most universal schema, negative core belief that people have is one of inadequacy. You know, if you downward arrow it all the way to the bottom, usually it's, I'm not good enough. That's what we end up.
Mm.
So it makes total sense. Just, you mentioned your kind of healing journey as well, Ben. And you talked about noticing a pattern of kind of sabotaging relationships repeatedly. And I remember this vividly as I was driving, thinking about this pattern. And you said that it was that realization that led you to seek psychological help. And I
Yeah.
just, if you could say a little bit about the value of that psychological help in, you know, the work that you did and the changes that occurred as a result of it.
Right. I will do, but I want to come back to that point you said about inadequacy, because you could imagine now, with what we know about prevention and response to child trauma, that we could potentially live in a world where we could eradicate that feeling of inadequacy. And that's the kind of thing we should be using the science now to work towards.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think schools have got a really important role in that. Children coming
yeah.
up all feeling that they have worth inherently, you know?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Every child to have worth, that's reachable. That's that with what we now know about child development relationships, that's a reachable goal, I think. So yeah, you mentioned that I got this appointment to be in this leadership role at the UN and in the country, and I went to a conference on deinstitutionalization. And they had Professor Kevin Brown, Nottingham University, a great guy, talking about attachment theory, and he was trying to explain what happens to kids in children's homes. And he said, you know, they grow up and they have these types of attachment models. And he talked about avoidant and ambivalent and all of that. And I was listening to it, and I was sitting in my suit next to a minister, and there were loads of media there, and it was kind of a formal environment. And I began to like crumble in on myself, because when he was describing attachment styles, I realized that was me. And I realized why I was like that, and I'd never given it a language before. So I I then and I had been somebody that had just never really sustained a relationship for most of my adult life. I'd had a long one when I was very young, and then I'd never maintained one, or managed to yeah, to sustain a relationship over time. And so I kind of really identified with what he was saying. I went out of the conference room at the coffee break, and I immediately called a therapist, somebody who I knew who was seeing a therapist, and she put me in touch, and I started seeing a therapist, and I did that for a year, and it transformed my life completely. And what the therapist taught me, taught me many things, but what it was a psychoanalyst actually. What they taught me was that not only was I kind of avoidant of like romantic connection, I think I was avoidant of getting close to people in general. So I had
Yeah.
people that were in my life, like I had godchildren and people that I'd known since I was younger that were really, really important part of my life. But I'd see them once or twice a year. I wasn't sharing my life with anybody. And I thought that, you give yourself a narrative, like you say, well, it's just because I work for the UN, I'm going from place to place, I haven't met the right person. And then at some point I realized it was the other way around. I was actually avoiding those relationships because I had grown up with a profound sense of not being safe, loved, worthy. And it's a normal response mechanism. It's a maladaptation to trauma that had shaped my life for decades since leaving.
Makes complete sense, doesn't it? Your experiences would lead someone to develop a self-protective strategy. Of course, you don't want people to let you down, to hurt you, to abandon you, to reject you. It makes complete sense. Absolutely. So it was quite a brave thing to do, actually. To walk out of that room and go, right, I'm gonna address this. It suddenly makes sense to me. You I just wanted to, I mean, it's good to talk about this because I think a lot of men don't talk about their emotional challenges, their internal world. I think, sadly, suicide's one of the highest causes of death in men in our country and in lots of other countries around the world. So I think it's really good that we can talk about the fact that you done psychological therapy. I've done lots of industrial amounts of psychological therapy, but we're all work in progress, aren't we? And if we had a chronic physical health problem, we'd be going to get physiotherapy or see a GP or go to the doctor. With a psychological thing, we either think of it as being fixed or broken. And actually, sometimes it's a process of getting to know yourself, of doing
Yeah.
chapters of work that sometimes they feel really urgent and painful, and other times they feel like something's just not quite right. And we come to those things over time. And I just want to encourage people to sort of see that as a normal part of life, really.
Yeah, I think so. There's this great, Carol Dweck who talks about growth mindset a lot. And I think that if we could come to a situation in the world where people had knowledge of mental health and language to understand mental health as they do with physical health to some extent, but also if that was embodied within a growth mindset, like we're all on a journey of growth, that things are not fixed, they're not stuck, they're not permanent, pervasive, and personal to us. They experience, many people go through the same things. I live this reality in isolation. I lived it in a way that suppressed it. I never gave it a language. And I think like breaking out from that was hugely transformative for me. It's like the world went from black and white to color. But then as a UNICEF guy, the obvious question was, well, if I can do this myself, can we not prevent it at
Yeah.
scale? And can we not respond to it at scale as a public health issue? I think also for me, there were two things that made me really open to it in a way that I might otherwise have not been. The first one was, when you work for like an organization like UNICEF, you have to create miracles. I've been in situations where, like in northern Afghanistan, where my boss has said to me, there's 5 million children in North Afghanistan, and none of them have ever been to school. 90% of them have never been to school. You need to get them all in school. There are no schools, by the way. You need to create the schools in improvised schooling systems in the next 3 months, or you need to roll out a polio campaign to vaccinate 20 million kids in you've got 2 months to do it, and you'd have to need a lot of coordination and work and support of multiple different partners to make it happen, but you led it. And I think that idea that things can change is something that had been a narrative all throughout my life. I joined UNICEF because I was really inspired by the work of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and then UNICEF works on change. So I had this very strong belief that things can change
Yeah.
at a global level, but maybe not at a personal level. Then later on, as I progressed with my career, I was also supported very much by my organization very generously to do coaching, right? So I go on coaching, and you'd have like corporate style coaching, and many people come to mental health conversation through business
Yeah.
coaching, particularly people in leadership roles. And so I'd also had this kind of self-reflective, self-critical examination that was part of the coaching process. And I think those two things, now thinking about it, really helped me just to turn that switch when I heard that professor speaking and call the psychoanalyst. And I think that's what we need to do. How can we help people to turn the switch? They're ready to seek help and work on themselves.
Completely. That's a brilliant description of your process. I think, and I hope this conversation we're having today will encourage some people who are watching this and listening to this to take that step themselves, because it can be transformational, can't it? It can, like you say, turn things from black and white to color, which is a brilliant description. Just moving on in the book, let's move ahead to kind of chapter 2 and 3. You talk a lot about the importance of the early years. You introduce two mothers, Emma and Olivia, and their partners and their parents, and you talk about that kind of group of important adults around a child. And we know about the importance of the first 1,000 days of life after conception and about the early years. So I just want you to say a little bit about why those early years are so crucial in terms of this story of child health and child well-being. Why do you think we need to be educated more about those earliest days of life? What's so important about that?
I think you've got this contradiction in most people's minds. Early years are the most formative and influential period for brain development. And not the only one that's important, but it's the time where 90% of the brain, the brain has grown to 90% of what it will be in the first 3 to 4 years. And most of our social, emotional, and cognitive development happens during that period. And actually, the most important educational institute in the life of a human being is not university or secondary school. It is the parental or caregiver home in the first 3 years. And so Harvard Center for the Developing Child talk about this idea of serve and return. The babies ask 100 questions an hour by pointing and babbling or eye movement. And it's the response of the parent to those questions that fires the neural connections that powers the growth. At the same time, none of us can talk about what happened to us before the age of 2. We cannot remember it. But Bessel van der Kolk, his title, The Body Keeps the Score, may well refer to that period because our neurobiology and our understanding of our place within the world and our self-esteem and all of that is very much formed in those first couple of years. It's disproportionately influential on who we become, self-esteem and all of that stuff.
So it's giving children the safe connections to trusted adults. It's given a safe base to explore the world. And we know that attachment kind of not only helps with emotional development with parents, of course, but it also creates a kind of mental model for other relationships in the social world that we exist in. So those early years are so crucial. And then you go on, you build on that in the book, and you talk about postnatal depression and the importance of educating the public, professionals, not to dismiss that and to take that really seriously, because obviously that can affect the mother and their partner and the family and the child, the whole system, if it's not recognized and dismissed as the baby blues, for example. Do you want to say anything about what needs to change regarding postnatal depression?
I use the wonderful and very brave story of the MSP, the Scottish political leader Kate Forbes,
Yeah.
and her journey with postnatal depression as an example of why we need to have universal access to parenting programs and support to parents in the early years. It was an example of one of the things that can really go wrong, completely unintentionally go wrong, in terms of the child's start in life. So I argue that the World Health Organization did a meta review, a systematic review with over 435 randomized control trials of parenting programs all over the world. I think from 65 countries, and they do things like help families that are affected by postnatal depression, but also affected by post-traumatic, the intergenerational trauma, or just a lack of parenting skills. And they work with parents to have the skills to communicate with the child. And if there's a problem like postnatal depression, they can advise dad on what to do or the extended family and bringing that kind of support. And it's a very minimum investment, but it is the vaccine to adversity. What the vaccine is to polio, it's the parenting program is that to prevention of maltreatment and violence and neglect. But what's interesting about it, right? So when the WHO measure it, they see that parenting programs impact impact child outcomes. They also impact parental outcomes like mental health, which is a really added bonus. Postnatal depression is a really good example of the conversation that you have with people when they say, I have these symptoms of trauma, but I think my childhood was great. 1 in 6 mothers are affected by some mental health um, problem during the perinatal period. And because we don't remember what happened to us before the age of 2, and often postnatal depression is experienced in without the person knowing what's going on, and certainly without the husband knowing what's going on, the ability to form an attachment, or for a dad to step in and be more engaged with the child while the mother has to step back, none of that happens in many cases. And when I asked Kate Forbes what would have happened in your family if this had been 30 years ago, it would have been a completely different story. Now she had a home visitor. She had a home visitor, a visiting nurse. They were plugged into the national health system in Wales. In Scotland. I'll be in trouble for that. In Scotland, and all of that came together to put protective arms around their family. So what happened to Kate could be addressed as a health problem, but also any deficit in attachment and love and safety for the child could be prevented because dad would know what to do, because the parental advisor and the home visitor would support them. We can achieve that now for every child on the planet. And the reason it makes economic sense, even for the most conservative, anti-public spending person, is what's lost from deficits in love, protection, safety in early childhood costs maybe 8, 10, 12% of our global GDP. Parenting programs to be available for everybody on the planet would be less than 1% of our GDP.
That's an amazing value proposition, isn't it? And when in the book you do go on and talk a lot about, the evidence around health visiting, around universal services, more targeted programs like Family Nurse Partnership, specific parenting interventions like Triple P, Incredible Years, and others. And it strikes me that when you look at the costs associated, say, for example, I think I read that an Incredible Years intervention for a family might cost about £5,000 when you add everything up. But the saving over the course of that child's life is something like £250,000. So the return is massive. And then when there were a few universal parenting intervention studies where they've made parenting programs available to the whole population. I think they did it in South Carolina, in Ireland, and also in Queensland, Australia. And they did, in this case, it was Triple P. And they did this program, made it available to everybody, normalized it for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, they found that they reduced child abuse by 25% at a time of recession when it was going up. And they reduced children being removed from home by 10% and children presenting at A&E with non-accidental injuries by 10%. But they also saved $9 for every dollar they spent on the program. So you think, hold on, why is this not the top of every politician's agenda? It saves money, it improves outcomes. Why is this not available everywhere? We could get into a whole conversation about why preventative intervention is always the first things to get axed when money is tight, but let's restrain ourselves because we've got lots of other things to get into. What I want to move on to next, Ben, is you touched on it a little bit, the value of education. So most children go to school. You talked previously about parenting programs being to child development, what vaccines are to child health. But then you say, when you're talking about teachers, you talk about if parenting programs are the vaccine to preventing child trauma, attuned teachers are the antibiotic for recovery, which I think is fantastic. So do you want to just say briefly about why you believe
Sure.
that?
Well, if you take, firstly, for the analogy, if you look at any public health problem like COVID, right, you've got to do 3 things: prevent it from spreading,
Yeah.
treat those affected, and thirdly, make sure everybody's aware of the problem so they can protect themselves from getting it or treating, and so on. And so I think that's what you need to do with child maltreatment. And so obviously what you're trying to do, the way that children are protected or the way they heal is through relationships. I think everybody's aware of that in the field now. And so what you're trying to do with prevention with parents is build up the capacity of the parents to have that relationship, to have to have a strong relationship with the kid as the best protective factor in their life. But for kids that don't have that, what's the next best alternative? Well, if parents are a primary attachment, is to have a secondary attachment with a teacher. And the Melvin Bragg, the British raconteur and kind of like TV presenter, a very veteran TV presenter, made the point recently that he interviewed so many people that came from difficult backgrounds, and when they told their story about how they became successful, it was always there was this teacher, and it was about the teacher making them believe in themselves and develop a passion for something and set a goal. And that's now backed up by the science. John Hattie at the University of Melbourne who does this fantastic league table of what drives learning outcomes. The most important thing is a teacher relationship with the child. That's for every child. That's not just for children affected by trauma, but for children affected by trauma, it's important to remember that children who feel loved at home, as somebody said, come to school to learn. Children who don't feel loved at home come to school to be loved, and that is a prerequisite for their learning. And so to have teachers that can just make a connection with a kid, it doesn't require investing lots of time. Peter Fonagy describes this very well. He came as a refugee from Hungary, the UK leading child psychologist, and he said it was a teacher that just invested a tiny bit of time in him to make him feel like he mattered as an individual, and that was enough to begin the journey that took him to be one of the most successful mental health professionals in the history of the United Kingdom. And so I think that's what we're talking about, making that a part of the education system. We don't have, when we talk about parenting programs, we have a systematic review by WHO that gives us the license now to go and work with government to make it a norm. We don't have the same level of scientific validation yet on how this all works. We need more of that, although Hattie's research points the way. But there are some really great programs being designed. There's one at Harvard, a Graduate School of Education, where they have this audit of kids in the school, and they work out get all of the teaching staff to mark which kids they're connected to, and then they see the kids that have no connection. It's
I remember
invariably the
reading,
high
listening to
kids.
this.
Yeah. And then they make an intentional effort to make sure all those kids have good connections too. And
So
again,
they,
the outcomes improve.
so they made like a relationship map of who are the key relationships
Yeah.
for all children. If there were children that had missing, just didn't have those positive relationships, they focused on ensuring that need was met.
Yeah.
Basically, that's a brilliant, and it's a simple and brilliant idea. And I remember,
Yeah.
see, all the things you're talking about. I remember where I was when I listened to it in the car because it was really vivid and brilliant.
Yeah.
Um, Also, in turn, you're right about what we know about this stuff kind of just evolving. We're kind of at the beginning of understanding this stuff, particularly in education. So I think I told you last time we met that we're working on a randomized control trial of trauma-informed support packages for staff and students in secondary schools in England, which is funded by the Youth Endowment Fund. And we're just coming to the end of that trial, which has been almost 2 years of learning and understanding what's making the impact for staff and students. Not surprisingly, our theory of change is very much focused on the quality of those relationships between the staff and the students, primarily safety, trust, connection first, and then everything
Yeah.
else flows from that. So it's really brilliant to read that in the book. I know exactly where I was. I was driving back from Croatia on a Saturday morning. I was at the lights, and I had this image of this relationship map in my mind, and I thought, what a brilliant idea! If we did one thing, if schools adopted that, that would make such a big difference to children's lives. One safe adult in every children's life would be wonderful. So yeah,
You know what's really interesting? Can I just make a point on that? When in relation to your teachers and your RCT, I asked Bruce Perry in the WHO review of parenting programs, there was an improvement in the mental health of parents, and that was unexpected. And one of the things Bruce Perry said to me was he thought this was because relationships are reciprocal. It's the same for teachers. If teachers are having healthy, positive, engaged relationship with children in school, that's great for their morale and performance as well. This is not just a one-way thing. Relationships are always a two-way reciprocal thing that uplift both parties, including
Yeah.
pupil and teacher.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. And we know that the quality of the relationship to a large extent predicts the outcome. So
Yeah,
in all kinds of psychosocial settings, the quality of the relationship is a strong predictor of progress or outcome or
yeah.
recovery, healing, whatever we call it. And we need those quality relationships to grow and to thrive, at all points in our life. So yeah, I was really, really pleased to read and listen to that part of the book, which is very optimistic and encouraging. Just moving on, we take a slightly different direction in chapter 6, where it was really interesting because I'd just been up in Glasgow and I'd had dinner with the speakers, and James Doherty was at this dinner, and I had a chat with him. Lovely bloke, and speaks so well about his own experience, but also about the bigger picture of, the systemic problem of violence and how it affects young people in particular through his work with the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. And then there I am driving my car again, and all of a sudden you're describing your interview with James about his life and the centrality of relationships, really, about how parents, safe adults, mentors, role models can be transformational when we're trying to get young people away from crime, away from violence, away from the criminal justice system. So you tell that story through James's lived experience. Do you want to say anything about the key things from that chapter? Because it was really moving and there's so much in it.
Yeah, I think everybody loves James, and he's such an amazing guy. We took him to Bogota, which was a global interministerial conference on violence against children that we were organizing, and he spoke there, and he spoke on a panel that we also brought Nadine Burke-Harris to, and everybody talked about how his story and his manner and his voice was so calming to people, and something really special in the way that he tells his story. And I hope that comes through in the book because he's a really special person. So he was a classic case of somebody that had grown up with a complex family situation with care background, had been recruited fairly young into gang activity in Glasgow. And then when he had a child, he wanted to change his situation, but it's very difficult because he also had addiction. And he talks about the journey that he went through and how he became a champion in Glasgow. Glasgow, one of the most advanced places in the world in terms of trying to address adverse childhood experiences. He became part of that brilliant community with, all of the people we could talk about that are involved, Susan Sadiq and others in Scotland. And I, so he talked through his story and how he then looked back and saw the moments with his parents, with the school, where things could have been different to get him on a different trajectory, and that he was working towards trying to create a world in when those things happen before kids get into trouble. And then I use that as an intro to really explore the what we now know to be the catastrophic link between adverse child experiences and vulnerability to being a victim or a perpetrator of violence, to getting in conflict with the law, to radicalization, addiction, and all of those problems. We know, for example, that 90% of chronic repeat offenders in most American um, correctional facilities that have been interviewed are having 4 or more adverse childhood experiences compared to 13 or 14% of an average population. We know that people that are affected by addiction, and all the work of Gabor Mate, and James is very interested in the work of Gabor Mate, all of the his work on addiction, research on radicalization, on trafficking. If you speak to the people that worked with the victims of the Epstein and Maxwell trafficking thing in America, or the people that in the north of England with the grooming, always, always, always the predators, gangs, and others go after children that have got high ACEs. So if you want to stop crime, if you want to stop conflict, radicalization, even in conflict situations, I've seen that conflicts are often taken over the line, the point of no return between communities where they become armed conflict because somebody with bad intention has mobilized a few high adversity teenagers to go and fire off some guns. So it's even conflict, even peace is dependent on addressing ACEs. So the chapter is really highlighting that, and that's not common knowledge. I think I told in the book the story of getting on a conference, on a flight with a delegation of people going to a conference on prevention of radicalization and terrorism. And I asked them how many child psychologists were going, and there was none. But I asked them who was recruited, and it was kids with mental health problems. Getting this mainstreamed, and the police in Scotland through the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow have tried to do this. But getting everybody to understand, if you want to build a more secure, safe, lawful, and just society, the single biggest intervention you can do over a generation is to end adverse childhood experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, I'm having flashbacks to where I was driving when I listened to that anecdote where you told about the being on the plane. Really powerful. So much imagery in the book as well, Ben. I think that's the really good thing that I like. There's a lot of stories, there's a lot of beautiful imagery. In part 4, you talk about the prevalence of child abuse, both physical and sexual. And then you also talk about the barriers to disclosure. I think that's how we met, is that I've been a long-time advocate for routine inquiry about childhood adversity. So if someone's seeking help, then we normally do an assessment. And in that assessment, we really ask questions about the things that predict someone's difficulties or might contribute to someone's difficulties. And for so many people, we know that is childhood adversity. So I've come to a point where I think it's almost unethical not to ask the questions. And you championed my work, and I went to North Macedonia and did some work with UNICEF, and I worked with the Scottish government on this, and done lots of proof of concept of feasibility and acceptability trials of routine inquiry, demonstrating that it's acceptable to service users, it's feasible across lots of different settings. Users appreciate being asked. Actually, they go, yeah, of course you can ask me about this because I've come to ask for help. Yeah. It's weird if you don't ask me about it. But still there's a lot of resistance to it. And outside of California, it's not a normal thing. So I'm really interested. We know this is so important, but I'm really interested in why you think routine inquiry about adversity in childhood is still not more widespread, because it seems so simple and obvious.
Yeah, I think that, well, scientific public health changes do take decades, right? So you're pioneering something that, and it's also Nadine Burke-Harris in California, and the people around her have been pioneering something there on this, and I think it will expand, but it does often take decades for things to cut through. That's the tragedy, and I think it takes longer now with public health breakthroughs than it used to do, because the world is so fragmented. In many ways, it's much easier with physical health, because physical health is kind of depoliticized, so it doesn't get affected by polarization, fears about culture in the same way. People talk about, for example, if we have a conversation about the need to give every pregnant mother or new mother micronutrient supplements, that's very unlikely to get into a complex political debate. Sometimes vaccines do, because of the vaccine deniers and all of that, but in general, public health evolved at a time when the world was less politicized and these things were easier to talk about anyway. I think with when I talk about stuff like this, even with people involved in the global policy community on violence against children, they still have this view that if you open up a conversation where people become aware of their own trauma, then you're somehow doing them harm. I think if you speak to Nadine would say that's not true. Every time she has this conversation with people, are relieved.
People feed a can of worms. People always talk about, oh my God, I don't want to open the can of worms. And I always say to people, guess what? There is no can of worms, because the person you're speaking to already knows what's happened to them.
They might not have but they might not be expressing it. It might not be at a level of language, right? It might be something they're not conscious of. But what needs to happen now with routine inquiry or ACEs screening is it probably needs to go through more of that journey where it goes to the point where you end up with a systematic review, an extensive systematic review that then can be taken to governments and said, this is the next stage in addressing adverse child experiences or abuse, neglect, and all of that, or preventing intergenerational transmission. The first stage from a global public health point of view is a primary prevention, which is the parenting and the stuff that's easier to do. And then when you build up an understanding of and a commitment to that, then I think your other things will come as
Yeah.
well. It takes time.
It's interesting. We train health visitors to ask. We've done a number of studies actually where we've trained health visitors to ask women antenatal visit 6 weeks before birth, and we get incredible feedback from women that have been asked these questions because they say, "What an important question to ask a
Yeah,
pregnant woman before she gives birth." And the women that have had a good childhood go, "Thank you for asking. My childhood was pretty good, but I understand why you're asking. This is important."
yeah,
And the
yeah,
women with bad childhood go, "Thank you for asking. I'm actually quite scared because I don't know what good looks like.
yeah.
Can you help me?" So that is a primary prevention opportunity by having that
I
conversation.
agree. Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need to integrate into the parenting programs. And you know what it does? It goes back to that stuff from the original attachment research of Bowlby and Ainsworth. Because what they said in the observational research was that parents who were able to process what they themselves had experienced were much less likely to transmit it to their children. So that's where the conversation is. That's where the vaccine is, right? That's the
Absolutely.
potency of the vaccine.
You know what, Ben? That is so important what you just said. One of the common reactions we get from parents, say if a family support worker asks the parents about their own experiences, they often say, "My God, I didn't realize, but I'm just doing what my parents did to me, and that's not good enough.
Yeah. No.
I want better for my children, but I don't really know what to do." So what we often see is a motivation, an increase in motivation to accept help in that
Yeah.
period of that conversation. They have a bit of a light bulb moment and go, "Do you know what? My kids deserve better, but I'm not really sure what that looks like. Can you help me with it?"
Mm,
So there's like
mm.
maybe a 6 to 8 week window where families are more open to help, which I think is a great opportunity of bringing in things like parenting interventions at that point, which they might
Yeah.
not be open to before. I've got three more questions. I'm conscious of we could have this conversation all afternoon, and I'm absolutely certain of it, but I'm conscious of your schedule. So the work on you may talk about the concept of ACEs. It's traditionally been restricted to this 10 experiences that Felicia and Anda originally asked about. It's kind of controversial. Lots of people say there are lots of things missing. Of course there are, but we can't have a questionnaire that is 30 pages long. You work in the field of poverty and exclusion and conflict. Do you feel that ACEs, the scope of this ACEs concept should be broadened to include those things?
No, I don't. I think that would be really bad mistake. From what I know at the moment, I'm open to be convinced to be convinced. Yeah, but I feel that I've said before that I think there are really four big groups of catastrophic burdens that impact children in a way that affects them for the whole life cycle, potentially. Poverty is one. Exclusion or discrimination is another, like racism or gender discrimination in Afghanistan. And then the third one is humanitarian conflict. The fourth one is adverse childhood experiences. And I think that they affect people from all social classes. And you have to have a lot of sensitivity to that. The universal presence of ACEs within society. So I think to try to go into this, what sometimes happens now in conversations where you have this kind of this shopping list of injustices that somebody's had. I think that the reason that doesn't work in this context, it doesn't really lend itself to positive outcomes. You need to be able to talk about adverse childhood experiences as they are and recognize that, in a posh suburb here in New York or in the north of England, a kid may have all of the privilege on the outside. They may be affected by incest and toxic neglect at home, which has a catastrophic impact on them. And as somebody from a children's home, I'm from the bottom 1% of British society, but I sometimes meet people from the top 1% who went to public schools, boarding schools, and they have the same level of emotional poverty that I had. They may have not have economic poverty, but they have emotional poverty. The second reason is that ACEs are now very much linked to our understanding of toxic stress. So toxic stress is something specific to kids that do not have a buffer. And I've seen in war zones and really poor places all around the world that children may suffer lots of injustice that will impact their life. But in terms of toxic stress, their parent is serving as a buffer against that. And I think that for those two reasons, the focus on the 10 questions, and then we can compare them over time. We can understand if, 57% of the population, according to the latest kind of group of countries in an ACEs research, had one ACE, and then we roll out parenting programs globally, and the world rolls out, governments roll out parenting programs, the school programs. You want to see the reduction over time. If you begin to add other stuff into that, you move the goalposts, you won't
Yeah.
drive change. People may feel good about sticking all kinds of other stuff in the ACEs thing, but it won't drive global change. And that's why I
No,
think it's important.
that's a really good answer. And I think, when you're actually having this conversation with people, you also say to someone, look, these are the most common things that we know the most about. It's not an exhaustive list. If there are other things that you've experienced that you think are negative, traumatic, adverse, stressful, please tell us about that as well, because we're interested in what you've been through.
Yeah.
So it's not just a score on a questionnaire. It's a conversation about what's happened to you. How has it
Mm,
affected? Is it still happening? And do you need
mm,
help? What
yeah.
kind of help might that be? So yeah, let's move on. I want to ask you about, you touched on boarding school. So in chapter 9, you talk about collective trauma in its many forms. You talk about
Mm,
racial trauma. You talk about the intergenerational impacts of the Holocaust. You talk about the epigenetic impact. You touch on
mm,
Rachel Huda's work, which I think is really powerful. And then you move into the kind of US government's program of, I don't know if I'm using the right terms, re-education and cultural eradication of the Native
mm,
American communities in the early 80s, where children were forcibly taken away from their families and their communities and forced to attend boarding schools where they were kind of so-called re-educated, which
mm.
basically meant taking away all the kind of cultural traditions and practices that they were, familiar with and had grown up with. What are some, just in terms of that collective trauma, what do you think are some of the ways that communities and families can heal from collective and historical trauma? Because it seems, to some extent, it seems kind of like, where do you begin? Because it's so big and so profound. How do you start to address intergenerational or collective trauma, historical trauma?
I would say three things are really important. I think the first thing is to understand that authoritarian systems, like the American system of slavery and then segregation, affected the attachment relationship between the child and the parent, as did the Holocaust, as did the boarding school scandal with Native Americans, as does what's happening in Ukraine when kids are taken away from parents. There's a conscious effort to sever that attachment relationship, and that disperses populations over generations, and that causes lasting trauma. And Rithme Menakin, the American African American leading writer on this, explains that over time these habits become cultures, and they become a culture of a community, and it's not addressed or understood. And I think we need to do everything we can to raise awareness of what has happened. The severing of attachment is not just at the individual level, can be at the collective level as well, and that has a catastrophic impact not just on the individual but on a community. And so we need to be much more aware of that. And when we think about humanitarian law, we need to have a real priority of protecting parent childhood attachment. It's a very bad time for humanitarian law in conflict at the moment, as you may be seeing all over the world, but protecting the primacy of the parent-child relationship or the caregiver-child relationship is really, really important. Secondly, I think that things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and other processes that make sure that injustice is understood and heard and recognized. Like even in the UK, the care experience community who have experienced some of the worst human rights violations in modern United Kingdom have a very strong sense that it needs to be heard and acknowledge what has happened as a foundation for making sure it doesn't happen again. I think that's the same in any kind of collective injustice. I think, yeah. So in ingraining that in society, the fact that here in the United States, where we have a history of 400 years of slavery and racism, that now every school celebrates Martin Luther King Day, and we have, some degree of conversation about the past. It's not enough. There needs to be much more. But I think that's really important. I think thirdly, culture wars tries to pit these things as a zero-sum game. The idea that if you're going to advance women's rights. You have to take away from boys. If you're, if you're going to protect one ethnic group, you have to take away from another. This is not really the way the world is. We are not in a zero-sum game. We can find space for every, every community to find its place and be protected and supported. But we also need to acknowledge it doesn't harm our progress if we acknowledge in a sensitive way that things that have gone in the past are wrong, and we have a human rights architecture to prevent them happening in the future. And it's down to us to make sure that we do that.
Brilliant. What a complete and insightful response, Ben. That was fantastic. I thought that was a really tough question that I asked you, but you nailed it. Final question.
Thank you.
This book is coming to a conclusion. I know where I was when I was listening to it. When I was driving a car. I've got all these images in my mind. You talk about the child development revolution, and you cite the success of the child survival revolution in population health. So arguing that in the future, we prevent childhood trauma before it happens, ideally, and we come to expect early and effective intervention when it has occurred. So that's a really powerful idea. We can prevent it, and I've been saying this as well for a while, that we know enough now to prevent lots of it. Where we can't always prevent it, we should be giving people, identifying it early, providing early intervention, effective intervention, so people's lives are not affected over the long term. That there's good recovery, there's good protection, they get what they need. Do you want to just, in the last chapter, you kind of sum up the key interventions and changes that we need to see for that to be possible, which I think is a brilliant way of ending the book, actually.
Yeah, so just let me give me 1 minute on the child survival revolution, because people don't necessarily know that, although I wish they did. So in 1980, a bloke gave a lecture at University of Birmingham, a public health academic from the United States, Dr. John Rode, and he said, we've reached the moment in history where we could save millions and millions of lives just by having 3 or 4 public health interventions universally available. At that time, 15% of children were vaccinated against the 5 deadly preventable diseases. And he said we could reach every child. So the UN, UNICEF, and WHO in particular got wind of this idea and looked at it and had a conversation with him and began to work together to roll it out all over the world. And the 4 interventions really were vaccine for every child against the 5 preventable diseases, acute diarrheal disease prevention through oral rehydration salts, because that was a massive killer, and it's very simply a sachet of the kind of thing we all take when we get trots, right? Making that universally available. And then the third one was monitoring children's growth, and the fourth one was teaching mothers about breastfeeding, the benefits of breastfeeding. Very, very simple, very low cost, make them available all over the world. And they enrolled kings and queens and princes and princesses and royalty, governments, presidents, celebrities, and they rolled this out globally all around the world. Every country in the world rolled out a new vaccination program. All the architecture and system, cold chain was put in place, distribution systems. And within a decade, vaccine coverage increased from 15% to 80%. I mean, the decade that followed, child mortality, the number of children that die from deadly disease every year, reduced by 61%. And this year and every year, millions of children live who would otherwise die if it hadn't been for that focused effort. So I think we need a similar thing on child development and child protection. And it would include things like universal access to parenting programs, universal access to an attuned teacher, and that needs to include universal access to preschool education, because you need to have the teacher in the life of the kid at 3, not at 6. And half the world's children don't start school until 6. Then also parental leave, accompanied by parenting programs. And then finally, support services for those that really need help. And finally, all of this to be underpinned by massive public awareness. And to package that in a low-cost campaign and roll it out all over the world, I think would have, would have such a huge return on investment. I think it's the discovery of the 21st century. I think that nothing that's happened until now with AI or anything else has had the kind of change on humanity that this could deliver, comparable to the change for humanity that the child survival revolution brought 4.5 decades ago.
I think that is a brilliant and perfect way to end this conversation. I agree totally. I think it's the biggest untapped opportunity to transform population health and well-being, not just improve people's physical and mental well-being, but also to improve their social well-being. It's been a fantastic conversation, Ben. I think we could carry on probably for several more hours. But there was quite a lot of things in the book that I wanted to touch on as well, but I had to kind of edit out really because there's so much to touch on. I'm sure people are convinced by the end of our conversation that they really need to buy your book. There's going to be in the discount code. If you're in North America, there's one discount code. There's two discount codes actually. And if you're in the UK and the Commonwealth, there's another discount code. So make sure you click on the right one. It will be in the show notes when we eventually write them. But for now, Ben, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, joining me today on this episode 1 of the Psychosocial. I can't think of a better way of launching the podcast, actually. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. And it's just been lovely to hear your perspective on all of this. And it's been a masterclass. It's set the scene. So, yeah, thanks so much for your time and for your thoughts and for spending time with us.
Well, thank you. It's been fabulous. Such an engaging conversation. And yeah, really happy to kickstart the journey with the podcast series, which I'm sure is going to be just amazing.
Well, we're really honored. And the whole idea of it was to have conversations with inspirational leaders who are making an impact in the world. So couldn't be more fitting. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.